At 45, Kevin was not just a CEO in a competitive industry, he was a pioneer. Born into a modest family, he had climbed the ladder in a world where the color of his skin was often an obstacle, and sometimes even a hindrance. He was the exception in a white man's world where the professional trajectories of black people were often reduced to secondary or subordinate roles. But Kevin had decided that this reality was not going to define him. From his first steps in the business world, he understood that he would have to work twice as hard, demonstrate rigorous discipline, and acquire impeccable technical know-how. His studies at the prestigious École Hôtelière de Lausanne, where he had been one of the rare black students, were a cornerstone of his rise. His rise in the hotel sector was marked by a mixture of perseverance and subtlety. Rather than imposing his authority by force, Kevin gained respect thanks to his intelligence, his ability to identify the needs of customers, and above all, to understand the human dynamics that played out on each floor of his hotels. It wasn't just managing numbers or contracts that made him a leader, but his ability to listen and understand the subtleties of his employees, even those who worked in the shadows, behind the scenes. Receptionists, waiters, but also those who went unnoticed, the cleaning agents. Those he considered the invisible soul of his hotel empire. The hotels he managed were havens of luxury, palaces where guests expected to be served with the utmost attention. The reputation of its establishments was well established. Opulent interiors with sumptuous atmospheres, rooms where no room was left for imperfection. Each customer was offered a service that met their expectations, or even beyond. But Kevin knew that, behind this mirror of excellence, there was a completely different face. That of the harsh reality of employees, invisible to the eyes of customers, often exhausted, mistreated, and left behind. Kevin had always had this conviction. The true test of leadership lies in how we treat those we think are invisible. He had integrated this phrase into his business philosophy from the very beginning. He knew that a leader could not claim to know his company without understanding the realities of all those who worked there, those whose work was never highlighted, but who were nevertheless essential to the proper functioning of the organization. Throughout his career, he had taken care to avoid falling into the trap of a rigid hierarchy that left too much room for injustice. But despite his efforts to maintain a fair company culture, reports, whispers, and comments still came his way. A customer satisfaction report, received during an important meeting with his management team, had caught his attention. The group had just launched an audit on the quality of services in one of its flagship hotels, a palace located in the heart of Paris, renowned for its demanding clientele. The survey results were surprising. In addition to the usual comments on the quality of the welcome and the food, several complaints concerned the treatment of the maintenance staff. Serious accusations of excessive working hours, degrading working conditions, and authoritarian and inhumane management. These complaints came from the employees themselves, but it was not the first time that Kevin had received such remarks. At the leadership meeting, he addressed the issue head-on, hoping to get an honest and transparent answer. "I just read the report about the Paris hotel," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There appears to be a problem. Why didn't we hear about these complaints sooner? And why is there no concrete action to address this situation?" Its general manager, a man in his 50s, sporting an air of total control, quickly brushed aside Kevin's concerns with a wave of his hand.
"Everything is fine, Kevin."
These kinds of complaints are completely normal. Employees are always a little dissatisfied, but these things pass quickly. These stories about working conditions are often misunderstandings. We have a luxury hotel, and some employees think that means they should be treated like stars. He shrugged his shoulders, unconcerned with the real issues behind those words. But Kevin was not fooled. He knew these reports couldn't be lies. Employees did not have the voice they deserved, and their fate was often decided behind closed doors. This response, so quick, so disdainful, worried him deeply. He was no stranger to power dynamics and knew that inequality manifested itself in many forms, even in the most prestigious companies. He understood that, behind the golden walls of his hotel empire, a much darker reality was at play. It was at this precise moment that a daring idea sprouted in his mind. What if, to truly understand the situation, he had to become one of these invisibles himself?
A simple maintenance worker.
No one would recognize him. He could observe the reality of things without filter, confront the truth of employees, hear what they did not dare to say in front of him. It wouldn't be easy, but Kevin had always been a man of courageous decisions. He knew that to create real change, he had to understand the system in its entirety, without illusions or illusions. The next morning he went to a costume store and bought a pair of simple work overalls, worn and out of fashion, nothing that would attract attention. He had his hair cut and got rid of his carefully maintained beard. He didn't want anything that could betray him. Then, in total anonymity, he took a train towards Paris. Once he arrived at the hotel, he introduced himself as a new employee in the housekeeping department, without revealing his true identity. The transformation was radical, but he only had one idea in mind: to understand what his employees were really experiencing. He wanted to see with his own eyes the conditions they worked in, hear their unfiltered voices, and see how deep the unjust hierarchy he had allowed to flourish, despite his efforts to avoid it. What he discovered in the following days would change his vision of leadership and set him on a path of profound reforms. On his first day as a maintenance worker, Kevin quickly absorbed the harsh reality. No one knew who he was, which gave him total freedom but also deep solitude. He spent his days cleaning the hallways, scrubbing the floors, washing the windows, and shining every surface in the hotel. At first, the task seemed trivial, almost underestimated. Yet as he carried out these tasks, he felt an uneasiness growing within him. What seemed like a simple cleaning job turned out to be more than just a chore. It was a living metaphor for the invisibility and subjugation these workers suffered. With each broom stroke, each polished surface, Kevin saw the layers of injustice superimposed. Supervisors, often arrogant, slipped through the corridors without paying attention to him or his colleagues. Their eyes glided over them as if they were only passing shadows in this vast luxury hotel. Kevin observed this dynamic with new acuteness. The higher-level employees, whom he had previously encountered in social gatherings, did not even bother to greet them. On the other hand, as soon as there was a misstep, even a small one, a harsh reprimand was immediately issued, often in the form of sarcasm or contempt. But the situation was not only marked by the coldness of the superior gaze. What struck Kevin was the intensity of the demands, unrealistic at times, to which the maintenance employees were subjected. The hours were endless, the physical work required almost superhuman energy, but all this was invisible to the customers. They only saw the brilliance of the marble and the chandeliers, without ever taking into account the hands that worked in the shadows to maintain this perfect order. The more Kevin observed, the more he perceived the abysmal gap between the privileges of management employees and those of the invisibles, like him. One afternoon, while Kevin was pushing his cart into the luxurious hall, an event had a profound effect on his understanding of the reality of his colleagues. Thierry, a pretentious-looking manager, stood in front of a young cleaning agent, Idris, who had just cleaned the windows in the lobby. After a hasty inspection, Thierry suddenly turned towards him, his face closed. "You didn't do your job properly," he snapped. Kevin stopped discreetly, listening to the scene. The windows were perfectly cleaned, but Thierry was clearly looking for an opportunity to demean Idris, a young man of North African origin. "You're here to do your job, so do it properly. You're not in the mood for that, frankly. Maybe we would have been better off keeping you in the dishwasher," he continued, his gaze cold, without the slightest compassion. Idris, his shoulders slumped, lowered his head, but his eyes were filled with frustration and shame. Kevin felt a whirlwind of anger rising within him. It was not just a question of poorly done work, but a question of human dignity. It was a systematic humiliation that was repeated every day, with the total indifference of superiors. In the following days, scenes of injustice followed one another. Kevin observed the incredible resilience of his colleagues, their ability to accept humiliation without ever rebelling, their palpable despair. Among them was Marie, a black woman in her 40s who had worked at this prestigious hotel for more than 20 years. She was one of the most competent people he had met, but despite her loyalty and commitment, she had never been recognized for her true value. His dream of becoming a team leader had been destroyed by a white and conservative hierarchy who preferred to keep positions of responsibility in an exclusively privileged sphere. Marie had learned to be content with little, but deep inside her, there was this dull frustration, a pain of being constantly ignored. But one of the most striking moments for Kevin occurred when he crossed paths with Madame de Montfort, a regular customer who seemed to embody the opulence and coldness of the world he had once frequented. She entered her suite, and as soon as the cleaner set foot in the room, she said to him in an icy tone, "You put too much air freshener in my room. I have migraines. It's unbearable." Kevin felt his own anger growing, but he remained calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I'll rectify that," he replied, knowing full well that his role in the situation was purely marginal. But Madame de Montfort, like so many other clients, saw him only as a decorative figure, an invisible object that she could treat with disdain. She was one of those guests who unconsciously reinforced the unjust hierarchy by only seeing the hotel as a place of opulence, without recognizing the souls behind the sparkling walls. Kevin felt each situation like an additional weight, a silent but brutal slap to the invisible workers. But deep down, something began to take shape in his mind. He was no longer simply the observer. He had become the voice of those who were ignored, and he knew that this experience would profoundly change the way he viewed leadership. The real test of his position of power, he told himself, now lay in his ability to reverse the order of things, to give the invisible the recognition they deserved. The final revelation occurred one gray afternoon, while Kevin, exhausted and demoralized by everything he had observed, was in one of the service corridors. His mind was weighed down by the accumulated fatigue and the injustices he had witnessed on a daily basis. He had seen the cold looks from supervisors, heard the sarcasm directed at workers, and observed how some employees were treated like machines, interchangeable tools. But that day, while crossing a corridor, he saw a group of executives on break, gathered around a coffee table, coffee in hand, exchanging knowing smiles. At first he thought it was just casual conversation, but what he heard froze him in place. One of the managers, a smug-looking man in his 40s, began to speak with disconcerting brutality. "These people, anyway, are there to work hard without asking questions. No need to pay them more. They just have to be happy to have a job." The tone of the others was just as mocking. They laughed, some patting each other on the back, others making fun of the docility of the maintenance workers. Kevin felt a wind of revolt cross his heart. These words rang like a bell, and he finally understood the extent of the problem. It was not simply a question of salary or unbearable working conditions, but of systematic contempt, a total dehumanization of employees. To them, these people were nothing more than tools, ghosts who moved in the shadows to maintain the illusion of a perfect world. It was a turning point. Kevin felt anger rising within him, but he knew he had to stay calm. He silently slipped into a corner, his hands shaking in both rage and disgust. He realized that what he had observed was not a simple lack of appreciation for the employees, but a fundamental denial of their humanity. The hotel hierarchy functioned as a closed system where only those at the top counted, and the others were condemned to remain in the shadows, invisible and mute, no matter how hard they tried. In the days that followed, Kevin realized that the decision before him was no longer a question of simple adjustments. He was confronted with a deeply rooted system, based on values of domination and exploitation. Yet he also knew he couldn't continue to hide. He had to act, and he would do it radically. He chose to reveal his true identity to a group of employees who, over the weeks, had noticed his caring, attentive, and respectful attitude. These few colleagues were the only ones to have seen beyond the simple maintenance agent costume, to have noticed Kevin's dignity and conscience. The shock was enormous when Kevin announced to them that he was in reality their CEO. Astonishment and confusion mixed in their eyes. Some didn't even believe it. They thought it was a joke. But Kevin reassured them by explaining to them how he had wanted to understand their reality before making decisions that concerned them. It was a moment of truth, a liberation for those who felt trapped by their own invisibility. The real revolution came a few days after this revelation. Kevin organized a meeting with the hotel executives, those who had ignored and despised him, and told them that it was time to fundamentally reform the structure of the hotel. He had been planning his plan for weeks, and he was ready to implement it. In the presence of all the directors, he announced that the salary structure was going to be completely reviewed. There is no longer any question of maintaining these abysmal differences between employees. Wages would be increased, and working conditions would be improved. But that wasn't all. Kevin also proposed setting up inclusive leadership training for all managers, so that they could understand the reality of their employees and the weight of the oppressive hierarchy that they maintained. The highlight of this meeting was when he announced that he would hire a diversity consultant to work specifically with managers. Kevin knew that without this training, without this questioning of their biases, these changes would remain superficial. He did not simply want to right apparent injustices. He wanted to fundamentally transform the company culture so that it became more human, more egalitarian. This announcement had the effect of a bomb in the room. The executives, usually arrogant and sure of their power, were taken aback. Some tried to protest, but Kevin gave them no room. He had made his decision, and he would stick to it. News of his decision spread quickly throughout the business world. The story of Kevin Diallo became a symbol of conscious and respectful leadership. His transparency, his desire to truly understand the reality of workers, and his commitment to implementing concrete actions to improve them earned him admiration and respect, both from employees and managers. What he had accomplished was not simply a matter of salary reforms, but a profound change in mentality, a questioning of the status quo that governed the hotel and, by extension, many other sectors. Employees, who until then had felt invisible and neglected, began to see a tangible change. They finally felt seen, listened to, and valued. Kevin was not content with reforming figures or re-establishing a fairer hierarchy. He brought a breath of dignity and respect, giving his employees not only decent working conditions, but also the ability to stand up with pride. Kevin, now a respected model of leadership, knew that to reform such a deeply entrenched system, you had to start at the bottom. He had started this change from within, with those who were invisible. And this transformation, although bold, would change the hotel forever, elevating not only the employees, but also the humanity of those who ran them.